Hello everyone, we're here to talk today about correcting the kettlebell swing common mistakes. We've got about 8 common mistakes that we're going to cover today, and realize a couple of things today about this video is, first of all, the mistakes that we're going to talk about are more related to safety issues with kettlebell swing. They're not really related to the variations in the kettlebell swing. So there are lots of different types of swings out there, and they all have a particular application, or many of them do, for specific goals. Okay, so we're not going to get into the variations of the kettlebell swing. What we're going to show you today is the most basic two-handed hard style kettlebell swing, and that's what we're going to use as our prototype as we go through 8 or so safety issues that we see with the kettlebell swing. So the other thing I want to talk about before we get right into this is the most important thing is that the kettlebell swing, this we have to understand, is a progression of other exercises. And if you haven't gone down that path, then you shouldn't be watching this video quite yet. Go back into the hip hinge as a body weight exercise, get into doing some solid plank position just to be able to make sure that you can hold a plank. Even turning into push-ups is a great idea. Then get into deadlifting before you get into the kettlebell swing. So that should just be sort of the ABCs and an understanding that we have before we get to this point together. Okay, so make sure that you follow down that path and realize too that we're not going to follow a dogma as far as the styles are concerned. And each one maybe has their own application. Let's get into the meat and potatoes of this. So we want to talk about common mistakes with the kettlebell swing. So the way that I'm going to show you guys these mistakes, by the way, is not in order of how frequently I see them or in order of how detrimental they may be. I'm going to work from the ground up, okay, just as a reference point. The first thing I'm going to show you guys, well, in the feet, I see let's just come narrow and let's externally rotate. That's extremely common. I see a lot of external rotation and also one foot off to the side while the other one's doing its job normally. So you've got to make sure you're lined up in the feet, and you can have up to about 13 degrees of external rotation is very normal, which means if your feet are completely forward, where that third, about where your middle toe is, you could put your big toe there, and that's about where 13 degrees is going to be. So that's normal. And you can feel free to have a little bit of external rotation just as long as your feet are even. I also see, this is much more common, is wide stance. And what happens with the wide stance is it takes the alignment from hip, knee, ankle out, because very rarely does the swing look like this. It ends up looking like this when you have a super wide stance, and you've got this tremendous angle in the knee, which isn't good for the knee, and it really changes the way the exercise is working. Geometrically, so it doesn't enable you to lift as much weight or takes away from your efficiency. So really, as a rule of thumb there, you want to be narrow with your feet to the point where you're very comfortable with that kettlebell. Make sure it's nowhere near it's going to hit you, but not much wider than that. So shoulder width should just be about right, unless you have a really large kettlebell that you're swinging, or if you're swinging dual kettlebells, of course, you'll need a much wider stance to accommodate that. But that's quite a progression, of course, if you're doing 2 kettlebells. Before we get off the feet, I do want to talk about too that there's also a lot of sort of imbalance. So you'll see rocking back onto the heels, which comes, I think a lot of it is just out of repetition of learning how to counter the movement of the kettlebell and staying flat in your feet. So I think some of that comes from practice with the kettlebell swing, assuming that you've gone through your progressions. Now there's something else that happens a lot in the feet. I'm not wearing black shoes on a black floor. It might make it a little bit hard to see, but what happens a lot is through the movement, so especially as the hips and the hamstrings start to lengthen, the external rotation occurs, and then the drive forward. Now generally what happens is if you start off with feet forward, you'll come back in the hips and they'll externally rotate, the feet will externally rotate, then they'll externally rotate more, then they'll externally rotate more, and then by about the 4th or 5th rep they'll find a comfortable place, but what they're not doing is normalizing, and so then by the end of the rep they've externally rotated. And again, if you're having that issue, it's usually a mobility problem, and I'd go back in your training to better mobility exercises, because if you're seeing your feet are moving as externally rotating as you catch that bell in the backswing, like I said, that's likely something going on in the ankles that you need to think about there. So, but it is common, especially to see that the feet moving throughout the movement. Okay. The next thing, we're going to move up the kinetic chain just a little bit. We've talked a lot about the feet, so let's move up into the knees. And this is not an extremely common thing to see, but I do see it, and when I see it, it's hard to program out. It's like one of those things that people love to do, and it's a body type where the knee stays completely straight in the backswing. And this also will put way too much stress on the lower back, but it also takes the glutes out of the equation and just makes it completely hamstring dominant exercise. And it certainly isn't a good way to train proper motor patterns into your body. In fact, it's actually a really bad idea to do that. Even straight-legged deadlifts in excess like that can be very detrimental if you're not training the right motor patterns that uses the glutes. So make sure in the kettlebell swing, of all things, you're not keeping those knees straight and that you're letting them bend back and facilitate that hip hinge. It's extremely important, okay? The next thing that I see, this is very common. It's a very common mistake, but it's also one that you see get called out on a lot, I think, is too much of a squat. So the bell here, and as it descends, it's there, and then up. So it turns the swing, instead of a back to front projection of the bell, it makes it more down and up. And a lot of times with that squatting style, you see a lot of this hyper extension in the thoracic spine as the bell comes up. And you actually also see this as a side note in the overhead swing. A lot of people call this the American swing, I don't. But you see that happening too, and that swing is a common mistake where it's hyper extension, trying to drive that bell up because the hips have done their job, but the bell still needs to float. Okay, so too much squat, got to make sure you're sitting back into the hips and then driving the hips forward, not down into the hips, and then trying to float the bell upwards. Okay. The next mistake is kind of like the previous one in respect to it gets called out a lot, so you don't really see it all that frequently, but if you do see this one, it's devastating. You can't let anybody get away with it. You got to go way back to the hip hinge, way back to the deadlift. If you or anybody else is rounding your back when you come into the backswing, so you've got to learn independent movement between the hips and the back, and that's really what that comes down to. So just learning how to move in the hips without getting the back, and sometimes it can be lumbar rounding in the backswing, and sometimes it can be more in the thoracic spine, and you can't let it get away with it either way. Okay, so rounding of the back, make sure keep that spine neutral all the way from the head down to the coccyx. It's very, very important. The next mistake, you guys, is probably tied for the highest, most common mistake I see. It's actually, this is probably the most common. Kettlebell, right here, starts to fall. You guys know what I'm going to do? And then the hip hinge occurs. Look at that. My angle in my legs is the same as the angle in my arms. And then this is happening while my hips are stationary, putting tons of stress on my lower back. It gets to about here, and then I've got this second sort of effort in the hip hinge as the bell tugs me back, usually hitches in the back. We'll get to that later. And then you drive it back up again. So this is impatience. You're being too impatient. You have to let your forearms come into contact as your hips come back. Okay, so let me be clear on this. It's not like your forearms are going to come down and hit your pelvis and then you're going to drive back. It's a fluid movement. It's almost like you're going to anticipate that contact, and it's somewhere between the forearms touching the shirt and the pants that the hips start to move. So it's right about here, they start to move, and it's just a very fluid effort. There shouldn't be a jerkiness to it, but you certainly need to be as patient as possible in letting that bell come down, letting your forearms contact your body before the hip hinge happens. And as you start to move up in weight, you will auto-correct that, because a heavy weight will not allow for an impatient return on that backswing, okay? So the next thing I'm going to talk about is higher up in the kinetic chain. At the top of the swing, very, very common to see. Shrugged shoulders. Too much upper body. You might also see, combined with this, areas of tension elsewhere, trying to hoist the bell, like hypermobility in the thoracic spine, trying to jerk the bell up because the hips aren't really being relied upon to do the work. Other muscles are trying to control it and do too much work. So remember, in this situation with the kettlebell swing, the muscles of your upper back, of your mid back, they just control your posture. They don't control the weight. Your hips are the ones that are driving that weight. These muscles up here, they just keep you in neutral alignment throughout whatever stressors are being thrown at them, okay? So backswing, you drive up to neutral and you keep them neutral and packed at all times, regardless of where that weight's pulling you. Pack those lats. Imagine you're trying to close your armpits. Imagine if you have a lemon in your armpits and you're trying to make lemonade, and you're packing those lats, and that's what it should look like. And if you have engagement in your lats and they're completely packed, then these muscles by nature will have to relax. Okay, so that's what you're looking for, is engagement here to avoid hyperactivity here. Okay, the next thing, okay, this one is, when I said number 5 was tied with the most common, this was the one that it was tied with. So this is number 7 of 8. This is extremely common, and this is a big deal. Don't make this mistake. The mistake has been made because it was taught this way by, respected teachers for a long time, and there was some confusion, I think, for a long time about how to do it properly. Eye contact. Your eyes will follow the kettlebell, okay? And when you're doing a squat, your eyes can stay on the horizon, more or less. When you're doing a kettlebell swing or a hip hinge movement, that's not the same. When you're doing a deadlift, that's not the same. Your eyes will follow the bell. So it's very common, I'm going to show you the mistake, to backswing, and even your patient, but the backswing happens and then it looks like that. So what's happening is, in the cervical spine, you now have extension and flexion with every single rep. And honestly, it hurts my neck just to practice doing it, but I see it all the time. Okay, so keep your head in alignment with your spine, look at the bell as you're doing those kettlebell swings, and you'll be able to correct that. The last thing I want to show you guys, before I actually show you guys what the kettlebell swing should look like from start to finish, the last mistake I'm going to show you is actually in the movement of the backswing. And what happens is this, and I can show you guys with a video, I can do it on video, but it happens so quickly that it's almost better if I explain it to you and you'll see it. In the backswing, if you come back with the bell, it should come to the back point, to its deepest point, in a smooth arc, and return back in that same arc. Now what happens is this: if you are, let's say, not extremely mobile in the hips, the bell comes back, you come back, and you can see my hand here, and the bell has momentum on it that I haven't absorbed into my hips, and it will swing upwards and almost hit you in the bum, okay? That's a sign that actually what you have now is a second pivot point, not just in your hip, but you've got a pivot point happening in your hand to handle, where the bell has swung like that at the base of the swing, because you weren't quite getting deep enough into the backswing. So sometimes you're trying to short that backswing. I also find that this happens when you're using entirely the wrong weight. So if you have a weight that's way too light, sometimes they actually get a little bit harder to control, and very rarely will you find that hitch happening with a heavier kettlebell, where the pendulum is just sort of more obvious and it takes you where it needs to take you. But nonetheless, that hitch in the backswing, it's quite a common thing. So here we go. I'm going to show you guys from start to finish what a good kettlebell swing should look like. I got this. This is a 32 kilo, it's a 70-pound bell. And I chose this one for 2 reasons. One, it's red, easy to see. And then also, being relatively heavy, it will make sure that, it'll ensure I'm using good technique when I swing it. So from setup, the first thing you want to notice is the proximity to the bell. And I'm tall, I have long arms, so I do stand from the handle of the bell to my toes. I'm about 12 inches away. So you're going to have to gauge the proximity that you're going to want to be from the bell based upon your limb length and your height. But you want to be able to, I'm actually going to back up another inch. I like to be able to lean the bell off of its center before I begin. This is actually my starting point right here, not there, okay? And that's just up to you. So this is the starting point, and I'm just going to hold it and let it go and tell you guys about it, okay? All four corners of your feet should stay flat onto the ground. You should feel that flatness all the way around and even. You want to maintain that throughout the swing, which may be difficult at first, but remember, this is a work in progress, and you can practice on staying grounded through your feet as you do many reps, many sets, many weeks, and many months and years of training. But overall, you want to keep your feet planted flat into the ground. When you're sitting back into your hips, when you are about to swing this kettlebell, really the most important thing is I have two areas of complete safety that I'm thinking. One is engagement of my pelvic floor, and just the entire bowl underneath my pelvis and all the way up through my abdomen and lower back to be completely engaged and ready for that weight. And then the other area of engagement, like we talked about, is the lats being engaged in preparing and packing those shoulders down and back. Otherwise, I'm trying to stay as relatively relaxed as possible. I want to notice the sensation of being loaded into my glutes and hamstrings with my upper body weight. And of course, I want my head to be in alignment with my spine. Before I actually take the weight of the bell, I'm also going to take one breath in, 70% or a comfortable breath, so that I have that breath in my lungs at the backswing, okay? There we go. So as you notice, my breathing on that inhalation happens as the bell starts to fall. It happens between the fall and the contact of the arm to the pelvis. The breath stays in. It's a 70% of comfortable breath. Stays in. Exhalation happens through pursed lips at about the float point of that kettlebell, okay? With anything heavy or medium to low reps, that's the breath that you want to use. If you're doing extremely high reps with a light weight, you can actually invert that breathing pattern for efficiency, okay? So hopefully that helps you guys with this kettlebell swing. It helps you to sort of self-analyze and to observe mine and to hear what I can remark and provide you guys with that insight. I'll do a few more kettlebell swings to get this video done, and you guys can let me know if any of the things I've told you today have helped in your training. Have a nice day, guys.